He moved down the street with a slow, deliberate shuffle, muttering incomprehensibly under his breath. His hands twitched in an unsettling rhythm, opening and closing, again and again, like a machine stuck in a loop. I remember those hands vividly. They sent a shiver through me. They seemed restless, as if they had a mind of their own. When he glanced toward Francis and the other children, I felt an eerie sense of dread. His thick, unkempt gray hair and his drooping mustache only added to his ghostly, lifeless appearance. He was like a shadow of a man, drained of color, of warmth, of humanity. This chilling account was given by Anna MacDonald, the mother of young Francis, who went missing shortly after she spotted this disturbing figure. Her worst fears were realized when her son's body was discovered, hanging from a tree in a wooded area near their home. The brutality inflicted upon him was beyond comprehension. He had been mercilessly beaten, subjected to horrific abuse, and in an act of pure depravity, the flesh from his left leg had been stripped away. The perpetrator of this monstrous act was Albert Fish, a man whose crimes were so horrifying that he would later become one of the most infamous figures in true crime history. But at the time, his identity remained a mystery, and for 7 long years, he continued to evade capture. Anna MacDonald's eerie description of him led to one of his many infamous nicknames, the Grey Man. But this was just one of many names whispered in fear. He was also known as the Brooklyn Vampire, the Werewolf of Wisteria, the Moon Maniac, and most chillingly, the Boogeyman. To truly grasp the depths of Albert Fish's depravity, we have to look at where he came from. He is a case study in extreme psychological disturbance, a man whose warped mind leaves us questioning, was he born a monster, or was he created by the horrors of his upbringing? It's the age-old debate of nature versus nurture, and in Fish's case, the answer is terrifyingly complex. Albert Fish was born on May 19, 1872, into a family plagued by mental instability. His mother, a woman seemingly tormented by schizophrenia, often spoke of hearing voices and seeing things that weren't there. But it didn't stop with her. Mental illness ran rampant in her bloodline. At least 7 of Albert's relatives had been diagnosed with severe psychiatric disorders. The medical knowledge of the time was primitive, and most of these conditions were simply labeled as mania without further distinction. What we do know is that 2 of them were deemed so unwell that they spent the remainder of their lives locked away in asylums, likely enduring the barbaric treatments of the era. Albert's father was much older than his mother, and when he died suddenly, the family was thrown into instability. At just 5 years old, Albert was placed in St. John's Orphanage in Washington, D.C., a place that was supposed to care for abandoned children but instead became the breeding ground for his most twisted desires. Life inside the orphanage was nothing short of a nightmare. The staff regularly inflicted brutal punishments on the children in their care. One of the most humiliating punishments involved selecting a boy, stripping him naked in front of the others, and whipping him mercilessly. This wasn't just about pain, it was about breaking their spirits, turning their suffering into a public spectacle. Albert experienced this cruelty firsthand, but something deeply unsettling began to happen. Unlike most of the other children, who recoiled in terror, he started to like it. The pain, the humiliation, the suffering, it awakened something inside him. Watching others be punished stirred the same feelings. Before long, the beatings became a source of pleasure for him, a sensation he couldn't understand but craved. This perverse connection between pain and pleasure formed the foundation of his twisted psyche. The more he was beaten, the more aroused he became, which led to further punishment and deeper shame. It was a vicious cycle, one that only solidified his descent into sadomasochism. Many years later, he would recall his time at St. John's Orphanage with one chilling sentence: "That place ruined my mind." The combination of inherited mental illness and extreme childhood trauma was a lethal cocktail. By the time he reached adolescence, his mind was already consumed by unnatural urges. He didn't just want to experience pain, he wanted to inflict it. And his fixations extended beyond violence. He developed disturbing obsessions, including an appetite for consuming bodily waste, and a dangerous fascination with children. By the age of 20, Albert had moved to New York City, where he began working as a male prostitute. But this was only a cover. His real thrill came from stalking the streets, searching for young boys, children he could lure away and subject to unimaginable horrors. He was cunning, methodical. He knew exactly where to hunt. He targeted the most impoverished neighborhoods, the places where missing children were often ignored, where authorities barely investigated crimes against the forgotten. This cruel strategy allowed him to operate in the shadows for years without raising suspicion. The full extent of his sadistic fantasies at this stage is unknown. How many children he harmed in those early years is a mystery. What is clear is that he was escalating. The question wasn't if he would kill, it was when. One of the earliest glimpses into his growing hunger for violence came from a letter he wrote years later. In it, he described a friend who had traveled to Hong Kong in 1894, during a devastating famine. According to Albert, the conditions were so dire that people resorted to eating the bodies of deceased children. This friend, driven by morbid curiosity, allegedly sampled human flesh, and when he returned to New York, he recounted in vivid detail how delicious it was. Whether this story was based on reality or was merely a fabrication of Albert's twisted mind is uncertain. There's no evidence that this so-called friend existed. But what matters isn't whether the tale was true, it's what it revealed about Albert's psyche. This was the moment, at least in his mind, when his obsession with consumption took hold. The year 1894 marked 4 years since Albert had moved to New York City. By then, he had likely abused and abducted hundreds of children. Having escaped punishment for so long, he must have started to wonder, what else could he get away with? At 28, his mother intervened in his life again, arranging for him to marry a woman named Anna Mary Hoffman. They had 6 children together, but the marriage was never built on love. Albert continued to seek out relationships with men, and his predatory instincts didn't stop. His interactions with his own children were peculiar, though there's no evidence that he harmed them directly. Instead, he played bizarre and unsettling games with them. One involved him getting on all fours, allowing a child to sit on his back while holding a stick or a hairbrush. He would then ask them to hold up a certain number of fingers behind his head. If he guessed the wrong number, something he always did, they were instructed to hit him. Sometimes, he would even call out numbers that were physically impossible, ensuring he would be struck. His twisted fixation on raw flesh also seeped into his family life. He would serve meals composed entirely of uncooked meat, watching intently as his children ate. They had no idea that this was merely a small taste of the darkness consuming their father's mind. Albert Fish wasn't just a disturbed man, he was a predator evolving into something far more sinister. And soon, his cravings would drive him to commit atrocities so shocking, they would haunt history forever. At the turn of the century, Albert Fish discovered a new fascination, one that would push his sadomasochistic urges to even more disturbing extremes. While visiting a wax museum with one of his lovers, he stumbled upon an exhibit showcasing tribal body modifications. Among the various displays, one in particular captured his attention: penile subincision, a brutal practice in which the penis is split open along its length. Some tribes performed the procedure using nothing more than sharpened stones, without anesthesia. The sight of this display thrilled Fish in a way that horrified even him. He became obsessed, fixating on the idea of genital mutilation, not just as something to inflict on others, but something to experience himself. In 1910, his twisted fantasies found an outlet when he met a young man named Thomas Kedden. The two entered into what could loosely be called a sadomasochistic relationship, though the extent to which Kedden consented is unclear. Fish later admitted that Kedden was mentally impaired, easy to manipulate, and willing to comply with whatever he was told. Then, one day, Fish led Kedden to an abandoned farmhouse. What followed was 2 weeks of unimaginable torture. Describing the full extent of what Fish did to Kedden would be impossible without descending into pure horror, but a glimpse into his cruelty is enough. He cut thorny switches from a blackberry bush and used them to flay the skin from Kedden's buttocks. He starved him for days, only to force-feed him his own feces. He shoved an entire pack of needles into Kedden's genitals and left them embedded overnight. He doused his victim's flesh in alcohol and set it ablaze, watching as he writhed in agony. But the worst was yet to come. On the final day, Fish took out a butcher's knife. He aroused Kedden, then, in a single stroke, sliced off half his penis. Fish would later recall, "I'll never forget his scream or that look he gave me." Initially, his plan was to kill Kedden, dismember his body, and take the meat home to consume in private. But the sweltering heat of the day made him worry that the flesh would spoil too quickly, drawing unwanted attention. Instead, he simply poured peroxide over Kedden's mangled wound, handed him $10, kissed him on the cheek, and walked away. What happened to Thomas Kedden after that remains a mystery. No police report was ever filed. No body was ever found. Did he bleed out and die somewhere near the farmhouse? Or did he return home, so overwhelmed with shame and trauma that he never spoke of what had been done to him? No one knows. In 1917, Albert Fish's already fragile mind suffered another blow. His wife left him for another man, taking everything they owned and abandoning him to raise their children alone. The betrayal shattered what little sanity he had left. His mental state deteriorated rapidly, and soon, he began hearing voices. At first, they were just whispers in his mind. Then, they took on a religious tone, commanding him to carry out bizarre acts of self-punishment. He became convinced that he was receiving messages from the 12 apostles of God. He would stand outside, shaking his fist at the sky, screaming, "I am Christ," over and over again. His obsession with suffering as a form of atonement became an all-consuming compulsion. He started inserting needles beneath his fingernails and into his groin, pushing them so deep that some became permanently lodged inside his body. Years later, after his arrest, investigators noticed that he had trouble sitting down. When he explained why, they were skeptical. But an X-ray soon confirmed his grotesque confession. Buried deep within his pelvic region and floating inside his bladder were 27 separate needles. His self-inflicted torture didn't stop there. Another ritual involved soaking wool in lighter fluid, inserting it into his rectum, and setting it on fire. How he managed to survive these injuries without developing deadly infections is a mystery. Perhaps his body had simply adapted to pain and damage, refusing to give out under the constant abuse. Around this time, Fish also crafted what he called his implements of hell, a set of crude torture devices that he used both on himself and his victims. The first was a wooden paddle with nails driven through it, which he would use to beat himself until his flesh was shredded and blood streamed down his legs. The second was a homemade cat o' nine tails, fashioned from a leather belt. The third was a rusty butcher's knife, and the fourth was a meat cleaver. He carried them everywhere, carefully wrapped in a canvas sheet. Between 1917 and 1934, Fish's crimes grew exponentially more brutal. He no longer just abducted children, he tortured, murdered, and cannibalized them. The true number of his victims is unknown. When questioned after his arrest, one investigator estimated the count at 100, but Fish merely chuckled and corrected him. "Closer to 400, he said. We'll never truly know if Fish's claim of 400 victims was accurate. The forensic techniques of the time were rudimentary at best, making it nearly impossible to link him definitively to most disappearances. And like many serial killers, he may have exaggerated his crimes after being caught, either to revel in the horror he caused or simply to appear even more monstrous than he already was. What we do know is that Albert Fish's confirmed victims were among the most brutally tortured in recorded history. The first known case was 9-year-old Francis McDonnell, whose murder in 1924 earned Fish the nickname the Grey Man. But it wasn't until 3 years later, in 1927, that he took his next known victim, 4-year-old Billy Gaffney. On February 11th, Billy Gaffney and his 3-year-old friend, Billy Beaton, were playing together in the hallway of their apartment building when they both mysteriously vanished. A frantic search ensued. Hours later, Billy Beaton was found, unharmed but hiding on the roof of the building. When asked where his friend had gone, Beaton gave a chilling response. The boogeyman took him. The boogeyman was Albert Fish. He had lured Billy Gaffney away, taking him to a remote abandoned building where he tied him up. Then, with the cat o' nine tails he had crafted himself, he whipped the child until his small body was covered in raw, open wounds. But he didn't stop there. While Billy was still alive, he cut off his ears. Then his nose. Then he took a knife and sliced Billy's mouth open from ear to ear. Finally, he gouged out the boy's eyes. Only then did Billy finally succumb to death. But even in death, his suffering wasn't over. Albert Fish butchered the small body, discarding the parts he didn't need. What he did keep, however, he took home to consume. In a letter to his attorney, he later described, without remorse, and with disturbing pride, exactly what he had done. I made a stew out of the ears, nose, pieces of his face, and belly. I put onions, carrots, turnips, celery, salt, and pepper. It was good. I then split the cheeks of his behind open. I put strips of bacon on each cheek and put it in the oven. I picked 4 onions, and when the meat had roasted for about a quarter of an hour, I poured a pint of water over it for gravy and put in the onions. At frequent intervals, I basted his behind with a wooden spoon so the meat would be nice and juicy. In about 2 hours, it was nice and brown, cooked through. I never ate any roast turkey that tasted half as good as his sweet, fat little behind. I ate every bit of the meat in about 4 days. Billy Gaffney was never seen again. But his death would not be the last. In 1928, Albert Fish set his sights on another victim, 10-year-old Grace Budd. Unlike his previous abductions, this one was calculated. It began with a newspaper classified ad. The ad read, "Young man, 18, wishes position in country. Edward Budd, 406 West 15th Street." Fish saw an opportunity. He responded, visiting the Budd family under the alias Frank Howard, a kindly old farmer looking to hire young Edward for work on his estate. His real plan was to lure Edward away, torture him, and kill him. He played his role well. The Budd family, struggling financially, welcomed him warmly. He visited twice, bringing gifts of strawberries and pot cheese, telling them it was fresh produce from his farm. He gained their trust. He promised Edward a job. Then, everything changed. During his second visit, Grace Budd walked into the room. She was polite, innocent, and full of life. She climbed onto Fish's lap, kissed him on the cheek. And in that moment, he made a terrible decision. Edward was no longer his target. Grace was. He fabricated a story. He told the Budds that he needed to attend his niece's birthday party that afternoon. He asked if Grace would like to come along. It would be fun, he assured them. She could meet the other children. The Budds, unaware of the monster before them, agreed. And so, with her parents waving from the doorstep, Albert Fish took Grace Budd by the hand and led her away. She was never seen alive again. He took her on a train, heading to an abandoned house in the countryside. As they reached the station, Fish hurried off, forgetting the bundle he had left behind. Innocent and eager to help, Grace noticed and ran back to retrieve it. Inside the bundle was a canvas sheet. Wrapped within it were his implements of hell. Once at the house, Fish instructed Grace to wait outside. He went into the bedroom, unwrapped his tools, and stripped naked. Then he called for her. As soon as she stepped inside, she screamed. She tried to run, but Fish was faster. He caught her, overpowered her. And what happened next, he would later confess in full detail to the police, was so unspeakable, so horrifying, that the details were never released to the public. All that is known for sure is that Albert Fish strangled Grace Budd to death, drained her blood into a paint can, and then butchered and consumed her remains. When Grace didn't return home that night, her desperate family alerted the police. But with no real name or address to go on, the investigation stalled. Albert Fish had seemingly vanished into the shadows, leaving behind nothing but grief and unanswered questions. Then, 6 years later, the Budd family received the letter. It was from Albert himself. In it, he described in graphic detail how he had abducted, murdered, and cooked their daughter's body, how he had savored every bite. At first, authorities assumed it was another cruel hoax. Years earlier, the Budds had received a fake letter claiming Grace was alive and well. But this one was different. Fish mentioned specific details, like the strawberries and pot cheese he had brought as gifts, things that only her abductor could have known. Handwriting analysis confirmed it. The gray man had returned. On the envelope, police noticed an insignia from the New York Private Chauffeurs Benevolent Association. It was the break they needed. The logo led them to a former janitor, who admitted to taking some of the association's stationery and leaving it behind when he moved out of a boarding house. The next man to rent that room? Albert Fish. The police set a trap. They knocked on his door and asked him to come in for questioning. As soon as they mentioned the Grace Budd case, Fish lunged for a hidden razor blade, but it was too late. The officers tackled him to the ground and placed him under arrest. In custody, he confessed everything. The detectives listening to his detailed, matter-of-fact descriptions of torture, murder, and cannibalism were visibly sickened. In his trial, which lasted only 10 days, Fish pleaded insanity, claiming that voices in his head had commanded him to kill. His defense argued that no sane person could commit such horrors. But the jury was unmoved. Albert Fish was declared sane and guilty, sentenced to death by electric chair. In his final days, he seemed excited about his execution, telling the guards, "What a thrill it will be. If I have to die in the electric chair, it will be the supreme thrill, the only one I haven't tried." On January 16, 1936, at Sing Sing prison, Albert Fish was strapped to the chair. After 2 jolts of electricity, the grey man was dead. Rumors spread that the dozens of needles embedded in his groin caused sparks to fly, even short-circuiting the chair. But this remains an urban legend, one last eerie myth surrounding one of the most depraved killers in history. In the end, Albert Fish was only officially charged with 1 murder, Grace Budd. Though he confessed to 2 others, there wasn't enough evidence to convict him. Investigators suspected him in at least 10 more disappearances, but the true number of his victims will never be known. And perhaps, that's the most terrifying part of all. This case is one of the darkest I've ever covered. But I believe in presenting the full truth, no matter how disturbing, because sanitizing these crimes only diminishes the horror of what actually happened. If you found this video informative, there are more cases like this on the Nightmare Archive. Check them out, if you think you can stomach another one. Until next time.